I first met Bill Troutman about 30 years ago when we lived in Kentucky. And here's what you need to know about Bill Troutman. He and his entire family were born 200 years too late. They all wanted to be, deserved to be, should be pioneers for our country. They loved nothing better, the entire family, all of them, than being outdoors, hunting, fishing, living off the land, scaring anyone they came in contact with. Imagine like the scariest character you have ever seen in a Western movie. That's what all the men look like, and the women not that different. I shouldn't have said that, except for one or two. That's not really true. Except they all have these huge, soft hearts. But they're stuck in an ancient time. We had the chance to go back and visit with them a couple of years ago, and we're sitting in a restaurant and talking, and Bill's wife looks over at me and says, "Did you tell Wade what you did?" And he just kind of dropped his head in shame, and I thought, this is going to be good. He goes, "No." And she said, "Tell him, go ahead, tell him what you did." So here's the story. He and his adult son and an adult friend were out hunting coyotes. Now, we can address all of that in another sermon. That's not what the sermon is about. Just hang on. For those of you who are against it, it's going to work out in your favor. So they are out, snow-covered winter day, hunting coyotes because it's just what they do as a family. And they live way out in the middle of nowhere. And Bill said he stepped to the edge of the woods and he's looking out over this field, and all of a sudden his calf felt like it was on fire. And he looked down and there was blood all over the snow. And that's when he realized he had been shot. And his son's friend got a little too trigger happy, for somehow a 6-foot man looked a lot like a coyote, and he shot him through the calf. Felt very badly about it. For those of you who are concerned, it's one of those, it went in one side, came out the other. They wrapped it up, they loaded him in the truck, and then the truck got stuck in the snow. They had to go back to the house, get another vehicle. They finally made it out, and they still live an hour away from the hospital, and they get to the hospital, and they start treating Bill. Now, here's the other part about living 200 years out of time. You don't like hospitals, and you don't like doctors. And I don't know that Bill has ever spent the night in a hospital, and that's exactly what he said. "I'm not spending the night in the hospital." And the doctor said, "You're going to have to spend the night in the hospital because we're going to have to do some surgery. And here's what happens in case you ever get shot." I didn't know this. When the bullet goes in, it is so hot that it cauterizes the flesh. And so even though there is a tunnel that goes in this great for chapel that goes through his calf, the doctor said, we have to slice that all open and then cut out that burned flesh and sew it back up. So we're going to have to put you to sleep, and it's so late in the day, you're going to have to spend the night in the hospital. And Bill said, "I'm not spending the night in the hospital." And the doctor said, "You don't have a choice." And Bill said, "Just do it." And the doctor said, "Are you serious?" He said, "Yes." And they did. I said, "Bill, that was a bad decision." He said, "I know that now." The biblical text today, I'm still struggling with what this text is really about. On the one hand, I want to say this is about what happens when humans encounter God. And on the other hand, I want to say this text is about God revealing something about God's self. And then I read it again, and I'm thinking about this is really about politics. This is about social analysis. This is about hope. This is about the possibility of change. This is a reminder. This text is a challenge. This text is a warning about what could happen to you when God finally gets your attention. We all experience God through a lens. There's no way around that. We all experience God through a lens, a way of understanding, a way of imagining God, a way of trying to make sense out of our experience with God and our experience with life, and for those who hang around churches, our experience with Scripture and with worship. And it's shaped, sometimes it's formed by the Spirit, but oftentimes it's formed by our own hurt or our own pain or our own anxiety or what other people have done to us, and we filter God through all of those things, and that's part of what happens when we read the biblical story. story. We read the biblical story, and it's about people who are having these encounters. It's about people who are experiencing God or encountering God or being challenged by God, but at the same time, they're filtering that experience through what's happened in their lives. And sometimes it's about good people, sometimes it's about bad people, sometimes it's about people who've been in pain, sometimes it's about hopefulness and fearfulness, masters and slaves, loving and hating. And every now and then, that filter, that lens is challenged through what some people call a thin place, where people and God seem to finally really meet. One of those places in Scripture is known as Mount Sinai. And when you meet that God, the God of Mount Sinai is a tough God. Most of you will know this story. It would help. That's my fault, not theirs. One day, Moses was tending the flock of his father-in-law Jethro, the priest of Midian. He led the flock far into the wilderness and came to Sinai, the mountain of God. There the angel of the Lord appeared to him in a blazing fire from the middle of a bush. Moses stared in amazement. Though the bush was engulfed in flames, it didn't burn up. This is amazing, Moses said to himself. Why isn't that bush burning up? I must go see it. When the Lord saw Moses coming to take a closer look, God called to him from the middle of the bush, Moses, Moses. Here I am, Moses replied. Do not come any closer, the Lord warned. Take off your sandals, for you are standing on holy ground. I am the God of your father, the God of Abraham, the God of Isaac, and the God of Jacob. When Moses heard this, he covered his face because he was afraid to look at God. We know this is a tough God. We know this is a tough God because just like your grandmother, God says, you take off your shoes when you come into my house. We know this is a tough God because God said, if you come close to this mountain and touch this mountain, you're going to die. We know this is a tough God, a God who appears in smoke and fire and noise, because this God says, you shall not. And why so tough? Why so fearful? Partly is because of the lens in which all of this is taking place, because this God is being processed through the presence of Pharaoh. And those slaves needed a God who could outmuscle Pharaoh. Those slaves needed someone who would not give in, someone who would not compromise, someone who would not negotiate. And if you've got a God like that on your side, it just might be possible for a group of slaves to imagine that life could be different, even after 400 years of pharaohs. Hope. Freedom, a new identity. So, a tough covenant is created. I will be your God, and this is what you're going to do. I command, and you obey. You obey, and your life's going to go well. You're going to prosper, and you disobey, and life isn't going to go well. And if you doubt that, look at the very first hymn in their hymnal. How is this translated, though, to new times? What happens as children grow old? What happens as old people die out? How do you take this vision, this understanding, this encounter, this lens, what do you do with it? And it morphs into what we call the book of Deuteronomy. It morphs into a second telling, a second reading. And Deuteronomy is what some scholars call symmetrical. There's a nice balance that's there. And so Moses will say, I set before you the ways of life and death, and prosperity and adversity. And so read it. Go ahead. If you're bored in class or in the sermon, turn to Deuteronomy 28. 14 verses of blessing, balanced out by 68 verses of curses. This is a tough God. But even in that retelling, Even in that harshness, there's an itch. There's this desire. There's this longing for more by God. It's there. It's buried in the pages. Deuteronomy chapter 7, the Lord has set His heart on you. Deuteronomy chapter 10, yet the Lord had His heart set on your fathers and loved them. And that word that God loved them, it means to yearn for. It means to lust for. It means to desire. It's a passionate, emotional hunger from God to be in relationship with creation. To love people. To be with them on this journey of life. And behind the facade of quid pro quo is this reality of this emotional engagement with a God who really cares and a God who has a soft side. And we're surprised when we see it in life, and it shows up. And when it does show up in our life, we're surprised by it. We're surprised that we see a hardened judge who sits in court day after day after day, and every now and then, that judge will cry. That judge will hear a story and actually weep in court. We see it every now and then. And we're surprised at some stern parents who decide that it's time to forgive. We see it in medical experts who ignore what the insurance companies say, who ignore what the time clock says, and give more of themselves and more of their time and their talent because they care about the people who are in front of them. We see it in demanding teachers who every now and then will say, we're going to move the test assignment. Every now and then will say, I'm going to give you a second chance. I know I'm really talking about miracles now, but it can happen, and it does happen. We see it in the lives of people who reflect what it's like to be made in the image of this God. And in the hands of the biblical poets, this tough God is transformed into a father who waits, into a husband who rages, into a mother, into a sister, into a brother, into these kinds of family images about this God who will not go away. So here's my question about this text. Here's my real question about this story, is why does this tough God insist on involving us? Why does this tough God insist on using us? Why does this tough God need Moses? Why not just do it? Why not just make it happen? Why not just fix the problem that these people were facing having been in slavery 400 years? Why not fix the hunger problem? Why doesn't God just fix the suffering problem? Why doesn't God just make poverty go away? Why doesn't God just go ahead and take care of injustice and evil and pain? Why does God insist on gifting you and calling you? Why does God want to use me? Because I know I'm going to mess it up. Why does God want to use you? Because you're going to mess it up. Why does this tough God want to use Moses? Because he's going to mess it up. Abraham Ratner is the artist who created this tapestry about this event. And there are a few things about it that grab my mind that take this text and just run with it a little bit. Moses is kneeling before this mass of fire colors, and he looks directly up at God with his hand kind of folded in prayer, and he's looking up directly, and he's afraid. And I am too. And the angel of the Lord has come out of the bush and is actually standing beside Moses, whispering in his ear, helping him to understand, encouraging him, guiding him. The fire-colored area, it doesn't look like the leaves and trunks of a typical bush. Where there are, however, in the top, there are these lines that I think are supposed to somehow represent God or the presence of God, and some lightning bolts. But the most important part of this is the left hand of Moses that's timidly reaching up towards this God, and just there, ready to touch, ready to brush, maybe even embrace the lightning. It's the little things that make a difference. Sometimes it's the little things in the biblical text that we miss. How long was that bush burning? How long was God waiting for someone to come along and turn aside and see what this is about? Was the bush there just for Moses? Or had God been waiting and waiting, trying to find someone who would be curious enough, interested enough to see what this is really about? And what does that say about God? And certainly we need to ask, what does that say about us? And Moses argues with God. He says, I am heavy of mouth and slow of tongue. I can't be the person that you want. The Midrash says it took God 7 days to convince Moses to go back to Egypt. This is a tough God. This is a sneaky God. Maybe that's what this text is about. The prophets understood this about God. Hosea understood this. Symmetry said punishment, guilty, finality, no softness, no second chances. But the longing inside of Moses, the yearning said grace and mercy and relationship and hope. Jeremiah knew about this. When Jeremiah was following God and it wasn't going well, this is a whole nother sermon, but this is a little footnote here. Just because you're in God's will doesn't mean things are always going to go great for you. Just because things are going great for you doesn't mean you're in God's will. Just because things aren't going well doesn't mean you're out of God's will. Jeremiah, having a really tough time because he's being obedient to God, has finally had it. In one of those moments when God is inviting dialogue, looks up at God and says, you tricked me. You enticed me. What he really says is, you seduced me, God. You didn't tell me it was going to be like this. Take off your shoes, Moses. This might take a while. It might take a lifetime. And Moses turns aside. This is such a small part of the story, and maybe I'm making too much out of it. God doesn't coax a fire out of a bush that's right on the trail. God doesn't set a bush on fire that Moses is going to stumble over. It's close, it's nearby, but he has to have some curiosity. He has to deviate from his plan and his path for that day to see what's really happening. So I hear people say, why doesn't God just fix stuff? I hear myself saying, why doesn't God act? Why doesn't God do some more of that God stuff and just straighten this stuff out? Why does God want to keep using us? And if God really wants to use us, why doesn't God call us the way, like Moses did? And maybe the question isn't, why isn't God calling people like that? Maybe a better question is, why aren't we listening? Why aren't we watching? So a man stood in the metro station in Washington, D.C., and he started to play the violin on a cold January morning. About 1,100 people went by, as by 45 minutes, he played 6 Bach pieces. Let's listen in for just a moment. So for 45 minutes, this man plays as people go by, 1,100 of them. About 3 minutes went by, and a man noticed that there was a musician playing, and he slows his pace, and he stops to listen for just a few moments, and then he looks at his watch, and he moves on. A few minutes later, you'll see a woman come by, and she'll throw some money in the violin case, and then she moves on. A few minutes later, there's a man who goes and he leans up against the wall. He actually stays there for a few minutes, and then he moves on. The one who watched the most, who seemed most interested, was a 3-year-old boy who stops to listen, and then his mother grabs him by the hand and starts pulling him along, but he keeps turning back. There's something about the music that's grabbed his attention, and every child that goes by in the video has that same response. Over 45 minutes, there were only 6 people who stopped and stayed for a while. The violinist collected $32, closed his case. There was silence, no applause, and he walked away. The violinist's name is Joshua Bell, one of the greatest musicians alive today, and he was playing on a Stradivarius worth $3.5 million. 2 nights before in Boston, it was sold out, and a decent seat cost you $100 to hear him. They couldn't see it. They didn't notice it. They couldn't stop. The world's a mess. Have you noticed that? Our world is in a mess. Somebody needs to do something. Somebody needs to change it. And by all accounts, God cares, and the way God is going to address those needs, the way God is going to address the injustices, the way God is going to seize the opportunities and act on the longings for community and love and forgiveness and hope is through some people who will turn aside and make a decision. It's through you. Some days, you have to become the answer to your own prayers. As my friend said, I know that now, but I'm just afraid.